Paul, you're muted. We can't hear you.
All right, well, that's probably good because right now I'm fussing at myself because when I try to share the screen should have a picture of Bill Morain on it, and I'm not seeing it when I poke it. And so it says I'm screen sharing.
Only have half of your screen. We can see part of it, but we're not seeing all of it.
No, but I'm not seeing any of the Bill Morain screen. Let's go back and try again. I could go ahead and introduce him in the process, but I'd like to get the picture up if I can. And I should be able to hit the share and PowerPoint.
I'm not seeing, okay. We're seeing part of what you have up.
Well, but we're not seeing the Bill Morain screen. Oh, wait a minute, here it is.
Yeah, it's there.
It's partly there, just a matter how do I get it pulled over where it belongs?
I don't know how you enlarge it.
It's like you have a portrait view instead of a landscape.
Yeah,
I
so
don't
how
know.
do
I don't know if there's a button on there for that or not.
well, I wrote the introduction and poem while I was in Kansas. I sent it to Bill so that I could get his approval on it. And I had started it on my laptop here in Iowa. So when I opened it this evening, it was only the first page that I had that still showed. And so I went back to get the one that I had sent to Bill and pulled that up to be able to portray. And now here I am not able to get the pictures to show. So somehow I have blundered here in a serious manner. Good thing we have somebody as technology expert that can help me out maybe. But so far nobody's able to see that, huh?
We can see half of it, like the first 4 words, like it shows William at the top and then it says a retired class something. Can you do anything with that drop?
There, it just moved.
You're
There
starting
we
to get
go.
it.
Okay, well, there you go.
Got it.
I didn't quite get it all there, but we're getting closer.
No, it's there. We can see it all.
Except, oh, you can see Bill too?
Yes.
I can't see it. I can't see it. I can't see his picture, but that's all right. I don't need to. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum again this evening. And it is my special privilege and pleasure to welcome our speaker and presenter, Dr. William Morain, who he is a retired plastic surgeon. He's been for many years the editor of the John Whitmer Historic Association Journal. He is noted for his effort to move restorationists from the narrowly understood terms like the church and the prophet to a broader understanding. And I quote from one of his directives: in the interest of maintaining objective integrity, manuscripts that apologetically advocate or overtly disparage any institutional or religious viewpoint will not be accepted. And there were other reasons for them not to be accepted because I've had numerous of them turned down too, but it wasn't for those reasons. His background in psychology with special interest in childhood trauma and its effects prepared him for the publication of the Sword of Laban, upon which I have invited him to expound with us this evening. And the book, I believe, is still available through Amazon. It is one that I have found profoundly stimulating to explore the various options. And this evening we get the privilege of having him expound upon it with us. And so I ask for you to share with us, the best of your questions and comments. Let us pray together. God of grace, compassion, dimensions beyond our comprehension, and awesome creativity, we bow in appreciation that your blessing does touch each of us with a prospect of being with you beyond our mortality. And we ask this evening that your Spirit reach into our souls to open our spiritual eyes to see beyond the confines of our aches and pains, our murmurings, to apprehend eternity. For we have all faced some trauma. Our dysfunctional human family has chosen to live by the sword. In spite of your clear instruction that we can have peace if we live in accord with your word. We carry the wounds of neglect, abuse, war, and hate, failing to learn the lessons of healing, of creative love, of the Zion for which we wait. We have learned defensive languages of sarcasm, othering, abuse, and guile, instead of words of blessing, healing, reassurance of human worth, of each person being worthwhile. So we ask that you would bless our presenter, Brother Morain, as well as the participants whose attempt to learn can be enhanced by this activity, and thereby bless our world through your extended touch by angels with skin, people studying in your spiritual university. For we worship the Christ, the Anointed, who heals our lives for eternity. Amen. Bill, I want to invite you to take over, but let me put in a warning for folks. Bill is slightly hard of hearing, and so it may be advantageous to put your questions in the Q&A category to make it so that so that way he can more readily hear them. I would encourage you to look at that as a prospect this evening. He probably can hear and make out, but he may have to read lips in the process, and so the Q&A option is one I want to encourage. Brother Morain, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
No, thank you, Paul. It's an excellent introduction. My mother might have believed it. I am able to hear you, and I've heard most of the others. So can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads. Okay. Yes, I'm going to take the screen here now and put up. Where are we? Here we are.
Terry, did you have a question before we get started?
I can't hear very well. Does Robert need to turn the sound up or something? I have a really hard time hearing everybody.
I'm hearing everything okay. Did you look at your computer screen to see that you're at full volume?
Normally I don't put it full volume, but I'll do that. Thank you.
Okay, well, let's get started. This is the book that Paul was mentioning. This was published in 1998 by the American Psychiatric Press. And it has a foreword by Dr. John Namaya, who was my professor of psychiatry when I was at Harvard Medical School. And when he retired, he went back up to where he grew up, which was in Hanover, New Hampshire, where Dartmouth College is. And I became reacquainted with him then, and he was of considerable help in working with me to change the earlier drafts, which were hopelessly Freudian, and give me a new slope, a new approach to this topic. Now, this will be a much more secular approach than what you are used to hearing in this particular group. But I would ask you to hold questions until the end, and we will take this right from the beginning. Let's not start with Joseph Smith. Here we go. This way. Yeah. Let's start instead with Stephen King. At the age of 4, Stephen King had been playing along the railroad tracks with his best friend. He wandered home as white as a ghost in a kind of mute trance, according to his mother, and did not speak for the rest of the day. His friend was found to have been struck by a train and was so mutilated that the dismembered pieces of his body were picked up in a wicker basket. It is likely that he directly observed the horrible event, but no one knows. King has never been able to recall what he saw that afternoon. What is known is that he began to write hideous stories of graphic horror at the age of 7 and has never stopped. As child psychiatrist Dr. Lenore Terr has stated, as a boy, King began writing because he needed to. A sufferer, always, of terrible dreams and insomnia, he conveyed his nightmares to people through his writing. And Dr. Terr, who is the leader in this field of childhood trauma, has written, "A whole life may be shaped by an old trauma, remembered or not." Now, Joseph Smith, and this is a very brief description now. At the age of 7, Joseph Smith Jr. underwent a series of 3 extremely painful surgical operations without anesthesia for a bone infection in his left tibia. The first one, the doctor came and did an incision from the knee all the way down to the ankle on the 7-year-old boy, trying to remove the pus. It didn't work. It became even more painful. A few days later, the doc came back and stripped the muscle from the bone, again trying to find the pus, but he was wrong. It wasn't soft tissue. This was an infection of the bone, osteomyelitis. At that point, the third operation is the one that his mother describes so well in the book. This was Dr. Nathan Smith, who founded my medical school, where I practiced for 25 years at Dartmouth Medical School, and he also founded 3 other medical schools. At any rate, he came in with several medical students on horses and performed this horrible operation. And then shortly, they sent him away from home to his uncle at the seashore, thinking he would get better. In my own opinion, I suspect, knowing of some of these children who have had such horrible business, particularly those that I've looked after who are burned and who have to go back to the tank every day to get debrided, that they may very well have sent him away from home for their best interests and not his. He would have reverted terribly to a retrogressive stage in his life. And later, he wrote a book about folks in chaos who traveled to the seashore. Let's talk about his comparison there with Stephen King. This is his mother describing him during his early teens. During our evening conversations, Joseph would occasionally give us some of the most amusing recitals that could be imagined. He would describe the ancient inhabitants of this continent, their dress, mode of traveling, and the animals upon which they rode, their cities, their buildings with every particular, their mode of warfare, and also their religious worship. This he would do with as much ease, seemingly, as if he had spent his whole life with them. I think it wasn't his whole life. I think just from the age of 7. Now let's talk about this surgery for osteomyelitis, which is a bone infection. Dr. Nathan Smith, in his memoirs, described the operation, which he probably learned when he was in Europe, waiting for Dartmouth to approve his starting of the medical school. He describes the instruments which may be wanted in this operation are a probe, knife, round saw, and 1 or more of Hayes saws, several pair of strong forceps, and a pair of cutting forceps. When I first began to perform operations of the kind, I was under apprehension lest so much bruising and handling of the soft parts as is sometimes necessary to dislodge a large sequester unfavorably situated might be followed with bad consequences. And some of these operations have been the most laborious and tedious, both to myself and the patient, which I have ever performed. It is sort of his worst operation and most painful one. And this is on a 7-year-old boy. This is what Joseph would have experienced in that. This is the amputation knife. He always brought it on all of his because he probably felt that there was a fair chance that he would have to amputate the leg rather than just to remove the diseased piece of bone. It's very similar to, this one is a modern one, but it's very similar to the one that Nathan would have used. And has probably had a wooden handle, but it's still a foot long. And it would have been not a nice thing for him to see. Now let's talk about that particular operation. He had over 2 weeks painfully with an open leg wound. I'm sure he was quite sleepless at this point. A dozen medical students came with him on their horses. And I personally doubt many details in his mother's description. It's hard for me to believe that a 7-year-old boy would be telling his mother that he was more concerned about her than about himself, and that he would instead just sit on his daddy's lap while the doctors did the operation. I think those are probably not the case. There was no anesthesia. It was likely the practice at the time was to spread eagle a child like this with boards from the bed corners. His mother left the room. His father helped him with the restraints, and that amputation knife was picked up. It was extremely bloody, as his mother's described when she came back in, until the bandages were wrapped and covered in white and it's back normal. But it's important to remember that surgery in its reality is a violent act performed by one person upon another. Now, what's the reaction to a violent act performed by an adult? An adult victim naturally perceived the act as an assault. The young child, on the other hand, will perceive the act not as an assault, but if he's being violently attacked by an adult, he regards it as a punishment because it's the only experience the child has. And the child then must conjure up a reason for why he is being punished. And usually he knows that well. He's thrown his shoe against the wall or done something, but this is a different situation. Why would he think that he is being punished? We're dealing here with an age-specific fantasy. And gentlemen, you and I have all been through this. We have no recollection of it, but it is part of normal male development. His young age corresponds the tail end of the universal male Oedipal perspective. This, you remember, has to do with eroticism toward the mother versus a father rivalry and castration fear and so forth. Now, but the father didn't protect him from the knife-wielding surgeon. Instead, he assisted the surgeon. The rivalrous father assisting the surgeon while his mother abandoned the scene and went outside. This, in reality, I think, is probably a real-life dramatization of the very worst-case outcome of that Oedipal fantasy. The trauma was both extreme in physical and emotional terms, and they soon sent him away from his entire family support system to the seashore. He was on crutches for the next 2 years as a middle child in an impoverished family. I think the child that came back from the seashore was a very, very different child from the one who got some pain in his leg. There it is. Okay, this is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, that we're talking about. Now, when you think of this, we're usually thinking of the adult variety, okay? This is the time, it's kind of like, if you think of the brain as a computer, it's kind of like putting a virus into the computer so that a specific stimulus will set off a reaction. Is very much like a combat veteran hitting the ground when the car backfires and trying to pull out his weapon. With childhood, it is different. It's very different. It's like reprogramming in the computer from the beginning. And the entire software is then reinstalled. And it's a lifelong effect in relation to that traumatic event. As Lenore Terre said, a whole life may be shaped by an old trauma, remembered or not. There we are. Okay, what are the manifestations that psychiatrists see, child psychiatrists, after childhood trauma that display specific trauma-specific themes? And there are several books on this, and Lenore Terre's 2 books are the best. But the things that they experience and that they go through there are 5 of them principally. The first is visualizations, what they are seeing and what they continue to repetitively see. The second one would be in their dreams when they experience the trauma. The third is in play. The fourth is in games. And the fifth is in dissociation. And we'll talk about that later on because that's a little more complex. Okay, for visualizations, I'm going to start and say that the Book of Mormon is one of those. We've talked about the chaos to the seashore and so forth. And this one is interesting. Who was the first person that died in the Book of Mormon? It was Ishmael. He died before they even got to the seashore. Who was Ishmael? It happened to be Joseph's father-in-law. He had married Ishmael's daughter. Look at those first three letters. ISH. Isaac Hale. That was the man that he hated probably worst in his life because he was the one that was so angry that Joseph had taken his daughter away. That one I don't think is any coincidence. It's the first one that Joseph knocks off in that book. And then we have the story of Laban, in which you're dealing with a fused surgeon father figure or avatar, if you wish. And then the sword of Laban, which becomes the talisman of power throughout the book. Let's look again at the Laban story. Laban is the very first and the most important of all of the evil father figures that appear in the book. And his only virtue is his magnificent sword, which he describes in great detail and which provides him with his potency. He is very cruel, he beats on them, and he won't relinquish the records that they need to go across the ocean. But Nephi finds him unconscious in a drunken stupor. And then Nephi confiscates Laban's sword and decapitates him with it. And he then puts on Laban's clothes as an identification with him, and then he procures the record. And the sword of Laban then becomes the talisman of power in the book. Laban, I think, is the fused surgeon father figure that punished Joseph. That is the identity that Laban has. And in a classic style, Joseph reverses the roles and he wields the scalpel himself and takes it out on this surgeon father figure. This is what psychiatrists call identification with the aggressor. They turn the story around, and this is the typical in dreams of children when they get beat up or whatever. They dream that they're the ones who are in control, and they do it right back to the person who did it. As such, we can regard this as a double castration event. And first of all, he usurps the sword, or the manhood, if you will, of the victim, and then he dismembers his punisher. So this would be a consistent metaphor with what has happened. This now becomes the sword of Laban. Okay, the themes in the Book of Mormon. Joseph is the Nephi avatar. Joseph is Nephi as Doyle is Holmes and as Shakespeare is Hamlet. He is the Nephi, His Majesty the ego, who the hero of all the daydreams and novels. And the Joseph Nephi character continues throughout the book. It's a phoenix-like situation where you have the young, powerful but weak, young, humble, plain, not mighty in writing, but the one who always wins out. This character continues to appear and under a different name. The most striking feature I found in reading the Book of Mormon is his bipolarity. There are no neutral people in the Book of Mormon. They're either righteous or they're evil, black versus white, whatever. Or they convert from one to the other. But it's a bipolar book, and it's quite striking in that way. There's one evil father overthrow after another until the final book, and that's another story, and we'll get to that later. And there are lots and lots of dismemberments in the Book of Mormon. I remember one scene where the hero is attacked and he lops off every arm of the person who comes attacking him. Another visualization. You remember the Book of Abraham and the papyrus. This is probably the original papyrus before it was damaged. And what you have here is a funerary scene. This is Osiris, typically, and he is about to, if you will, impregnate his daughter Isis, which you can see up here as a bird. And then you have this other bird with a human head who's going to restore life. And this is the jackal Anubis, who is going to do the embalming. You notice the feathers of the bird right here. Well, it turns out that when he got it, this is what he saw, because the rest of this papyrus had been torn away, and so this was all that he saw. Look where the bird's feathers are, right up here. And here, next one is the actual papyrus. And you can see this with the pieces that are missing. But someone who had the particular authority to do so made some sketches on this papyrus. And if we take away everything except the sketches, what we see is this. This is what Joseph drew. And I think it speaks for itself. The feathers on the bird have become a second hand. He's holding them up in front of his face. No, 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 please don't do this. And we know who this is. And this is another representation, if you will. That's the start. That's the sword of Laban. Okay, the second one is dreams, I've mentioned. This was Joseph's final dream in the night before he was assassinated. Someone was in there with him and came out and before he was killed and described it. The setting was in an old family barn amidst weeds and decay. And as it was described, suddenly a group of men burst into the barn and their leader accused him of trespassing, stating it was none of mine and that I must give up all hope of ever possessing it. Remember the Oedipus piece. The leader would not be pacified, threatening Joseph with the destruction of my body. And then a rabble rushed in and nearly filled the barn, drew out their knives, following which Joseph struggled out of the barn about up to my ankles in mud, again bound by his legs. It appears over and over. Let's call this the temple rituals. And this is one of those that he's like children who have been traumatized and have play. Like the other kids seem to like to play it. The first ritual, of course, was foot washing. And the quote is here, I then said to the elders, as I have done so, do ye. Wash you therefore another's feet, and by the power of the Holy Ghost, I pronounce them all clean from the blood of this generation. Another quote, brother, having authority, I wash you that you may be clean from the blood and sins of this generation. Folks, I have read an entire book on foot washing. It's an ancient ritual. It goes back, particularly in the Levant, to very, very early times. It is a very comforting balm to do. But never, ever in foot washing has blood ever been a part of the picture until Joseph Smith. For him, this phrase, blood on garments, which is used throughout his writings, is used as a metaphor for sin. And furthermore, the first temple garments actually had bindings of turkey red, which were later removed. And in the original one, Joseph actually slashed the garment across the knee so deeply that it drew blood and healed with a noticeable scar. When he started to anoint women as well, they made him stop it. But it's significant because the part of the tibia bone, which is infected in osteomyelitis, is the extreme upper portion immediately south of the knee. So again, it is a representation of that initial event. And of course, the sword appears also in the temple rituals. Now, this is a stretch, but let's call polygamy one of his games. And talking about game theory, he has a recurring dream of an angel with a drawn sword that demands that he perform polygamy. This is a recurring dream. He refers to it many, many times. The key here is that recurring dreams always, always have a referent in real life. Mine is that I'm going into class and I've got an exam and I've never studied for it. And I'm terrified. And that one comes over and over. Each of you probably have your own. But recurring dreams are different from regular dreams. This is sort of a you're it. It's a seduction game with women who are given a choice. The option one is a superstructure of promise of afterlife of bliss, and if he will only submit to Joseph. Option two is sometimes used, which is the alternative, and that's causing Joseph's destruction. It was Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner who said that Joseph approached him 3 times, and the third time he said he was confronted by an angel with a drawn sword in his dream, and if he didn't take Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner for his wife, the angel would take his potency, his priesthood, and his life away from him. This is the recurring dream, and that's how he justified the polygamy. Now, how do you explain this? This is a complicated one, and it comes from Dr. Fenichel, who is a German psychoanalyst. We all know what a phobia is. That's the compulsive retreat from the most feared object. For me, it's acrophobia. I can't stand heights, ladders, all of that. Then you have the unusual situation, which sometimes come up, which is called a counterphobia. And instead, this is an attempt to get rid of the fear by approaching the thing which is most feared. And remember again the Oedipal piece. He was initially punished for eroticism. And if I do it enough times, I simply won't fear it anymore. And for Joseph, eroticism was always carried the threat of violence. Now, the counterphobia is also one of the things that psychiatrists describe with girls who are molested early in life. And many of them become prostitutes for the same reason. If I can only do it enough times, it won't be fearful. It's a very legitimate psychiatric piece. Now we come to dissociation. And again, Dr. Namiah, who was of such great help to me, has done a great deal of work on dissociation. And his description of it is as follows. The persons are out of contact with their environment. They appear preoccupied with a private world, and if their eyes are open, are seen to be staring into space. They may appear emotionally upset, speak excitedly in words or sentences that are frequently hard to understand. It can be determined that their behavior represents the external manifestation of the inner hallucinatory re-experiencing of a traumatic event. Again, Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner describes him. At once his countenance changed, and he stood mute. There was a searchlight within him over every part of his body. I never saw anything like it on earth. He got so white that anyone who saw him would have thought he was transparent. In another episode, after his tar and feathering, Joseph said his spirit seemed to leave his body, and that during the period of insensibility, he consciously stood over his own body, feeling no pain, but seeing and hearing all that transpired. That is a textbook description of dissociation. Now, let's change the subject. There is a secret in the book of Ether. For the first time, after 500 some pages, we get the first real new character, and he's identified through his brother, not through his father. And this brother of Jared is immaculately perfect in all respects, and he is so noble that his name can't even be spoken. But in the new world, when the leadership transfers and brother of Jared gets old, the leadership goes to Jared's line, not the brother of Jared. This is the passing of the firstborn torch from the older to the younger brother. Here, Joseph is not Nephi, Joseph is Jared, and the deceased firstborn Alvin is the unnamed brother. This is one of my favorite ironies. The person who has done most of the research on children's reaction to sibling death is a man by the name of Kane, the University of Michigan. Kane on sibling death. His description is that the principal reaction to sibling death is overwhelming guilt that may still be consciously active 5 years or more after the sibling's death. Such children feel responsible for the death, sporadically insisting it was all their fault, feeling they should have died too, or should have died instead of the dead sibling. That's the principal reaction of children when their sibling dies. I will admit to having a bit of it when Tom died. Now, let's look again at the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. Let's look at the dates. Joseph says that September 22, 1823 was the first visit in which he was punished, he was knocked to the ground and couldn't have the plates, and he was told he had to bring Alvin the next year in order to get the plates. In September 22, 1824 and 25, both he was punished again and forbidden to take the plates. And again, now on September 22, 1826, he does acquire the plates because he's found the substitute, and that's his new wife, Emma. And 9 or 10 months later, she has their first child, who's named Alvin, and died, is deformed and died. On September 25, 1824, Joseph's father and others exhumed Alvin's corpse. Interestingly, September 25, 1824, and September 22, 1826 are both the final Saturday in September. I think it is far more than a coincidence that this is the case. I think this is a classic anniversary reaction from Joseph having seen Alvin's putrefying corpse, and I think it represents a second trauma. The fact is that there are no contemporary counts of any visits to the hill before June of 1826. He finally tells some person in June before he goes there in September. Other than the family's recitation of what Joseph has developed as this story. I do not think that there were any earlier visits back. I think it is a fantasy that's been backdated into 1823 in order to incorporate Alvin into the story. I don't think any of those visits happened. I think Joseph's guilt is expressed through the punishment that the angels meted out to him. Anniversary reactions are very common for anniversaries of rapes, deaths, and so forth. This is a very different description of it, but it seems to me that there is no evidence that he really made any other trips up the hill before 1826. Now, Alvin plays another role in this story. Alvin hadn't been baptized when he died, and Joseph had to make it right in order to assuage his guilt over Alvin's death. But he made baptism of the dead specific. It's only for relatives. Why would he have done that? Why couldn't anyone baptize anyone for the dead, but only for relatives? I think it answers its own question. And interestingly, this suddenly came about de novo in September when his father was on his deathbed. And it's well known that many individuals who have a severe bereavement problem at the death of someone, actually, it is not for the person who died, but because it awakens a memory of someone who had died before. And I think that's what this is all about. Now, this is a tough one, but I think Alvin plays a third role. Let's remember the second vision. There were two personages, father and son. And the father, giving approval, tells Joseph to listen to the son. And it is the son, let's say Brother Alvin, who lays the mantle of power onto Joseph. Again, we're dealing with the passage of the firstborn torch, the same method, same message as in the book of Ether. I'm done.
Wow, this is fascinating. Fascinating. Thank you, Bill, for the presentation. I'm intrigued. I've read the book years ago, and I've been admiring the book ever since because it offered so much explanation of what had not been clear to me, and in some respects is still not. But I am intrigued. Well, because just this last year, because I've had that anniversary experience, the anniversary of Rena's death on the 28th of February, and when she came back and nudged me to find two historical documents that had not been together for 148 years.
Yeah, well, thank you. What I gave was a very, very brief description. The book goes into far, far more detail, and I apologize for not being able to give much more than that. But those are the main points. They take many pages sometimes to explain, but let's just say that it may or may not be the fact, but it fits the theory. Okay. You may not accept that theory, but it does fit in most respects with what psychiatrists feel. Now, I've taken care of an awful lot of young kids, and I've watched particularly those that are burned, that have to be taken to the tank twice a day and clean up the burned tissue, and they scream, they yell, and they urinate and defecate in the water. It's an awful thing to have to do, and it bothered me as much as it bothered Nathan Smith about how much he was troubled by it, because I know that there will be scars that are not seen, just like their scars would be where the burns are on the surface. So I've watched these kids, and I understand, and I can barely imagine what it was like for a 7-year-old boy who had no knowledge of really what was happening or why it was being done.
If I could take one other angle at that, I'm intrigued that both Joseph and Emma and Joseph III and his first two wives lost half of their children. That's more of an adult trauma, perhaps, but I'm wondering if you would care to comment about how the trauma of losing children fits into this whole story?
Well, Joseph and Emma lost their first child. They named him Alvin. He was very deformed. And it was shortly thereafter that he lost the 116 pages. So it was a double hit. And we know from the experience of Dr. Lindemann at the Massachusetts General Hospital, who managed all of those burns in the Coconut Grove fire in Boston, that a double hit is about, you add one and one and get about 16. It's really, really bad. And that's when Joseph got his first prophecy, shortly after that. And he was obviously very deeply disturbed by those two losses. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the first thing that comes to mind when you mention that.
Well, let's open up for the other people that have questions and comments. I'm confident this group will have a bunch of them.
Okay. James Lucas, you're first, and then David DeBarth. Go ahead, please, James.
I know that we're kind of dealing with everything on a cursory surface level here, and I haven't read your book, so I'm sure there's much more detail there. So if this is kind of too general of a question, please let me know. But another aspect of the childhood surgery on Joseph could be that, well, let me ask you if you think that another aspect of the childhood surgery would be a more religious frame of mind, a turn to religion. We have the accounts in Lucy's biography of, her commenting that Joseph was more inclined toward religious questions. He was given to pondering on, deep issues, or I can't remember exactly how she phrased it, but there's a number of comments in the sources like that. And then obviously the simple fact that he does in fact pursue this religious career, as he gets older. So I was wondering if you could also link those aspects of Joseph's personality to the impetus of this childhood trauma.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a very good comment. He did mention, and I pointed out on one of those slides that in his descriptions in his teen years around the family fireplace, that he was talking about the religion of the early inhabitants of the continent. But religion, of course, is always a search for meaning. And when you've got so many troubled pieces, you're looking for in every direction for it. I'm not at all surprised that it turned in a religious direction.
Okay, I mean, that was sort of, we wrote a book that included a bit of Joseph Smith biography. And that was, kind of our conclusion was that this was a trigger for this religious direction that his life took from that point forward. And we found evidence, for example, that when he was at Salem on the seashore with his very religious Uncle Jesse, that he may well have, even that early on, been exposed to, Protestant literature intended for young children and so forth, which would have already set him on a track of being, especially interested in religious issues and so forth.
Absolutely. He had no support system around him except Uncle Jesse. And Uncle Jesse's religion would have been central to his experience there at the seashore. So that's a very good point.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, James. David, go ahead, please.
Thank you. And thank you, Bill. It's a fascinating presentation. I'd like to ask a question a little different. And I think I may be asking you to speculate, but what kind of event occurs that a surgery like this has to happen? Something triggered this in the first place. Do you have any speculation what that might have been?
Well, yeah, there was a typhoid epidemic going around the Upper Connecticut River Valley at that time. And as you remember, his sister Sophronia got it first, and mother was very disturbed about that. And then it's the Salmonella typhi bacteria. And the first thing he got was not in the leg, it was in his armpit, the axilla. He developed an abscess there with the Salmonella bacteria, and it grew until it got to the point where it was huge, and the doctor came and plunged a knife into it, and a full quart of pus came out. Then presumably it circulated in his bloodstream and landed in the tibia. That's the best explanation that we have, and it arose from a typhoid epidemic.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
And just to add a little detail to that, that typhoid epidemic was so widespread that it resulted in the closure of the school where Hiram was going. They shut down Dartmouth for a year as a result of that, which of course in our times evokes some relatively recent experiences that we've all gone through.
Yeah. Good thought.
Bill, I would appreciate it if you would offer some clarification, because your table of contents addresses a wide variety of profound impacts here, and the idea of what is it? The translation is the way you put it on the at the heading of the chapter. So since you have James Lucas on the forum tonight as well, and he has written about this extensively, but you're saying the book was written as while in a trance?
Well, we know that the mechanism for doing this was putting a stone in a hat and putting his head down into the hat, and then speaking. That's standard so-called scrying that the darkness and whatever seems to be the leading into a kind of a trance-like affair. Now, this is where Dr. Robert Anderson, who wrote the Inside the Mind of Joseph Smith, disagrees with me. He says that the Book of Mormon is so well structured that it could not possibly have been done in a trance. I think the stories were being developed over the years so that he had all of the stories and he simply had to put them into some kind of organization. But that book, I wrote that before Robert Anderson's book, and there is some truth to what he says, that it, although it is a scrying kind of thing, which is sort of like the crystal ball and so forth, staring into it long enough, and then the associations begin to come out. But it is a very well organized book, and as Dr. Anderson says, he's the real psychiatrist. Actually, I just play one in Mormon history meetings, but he is the one who says that it is probably not a trance because of the high degree of organization. But it's a good question. I like to have titles that draw attention, and that was a pun I wanted to use.
Well, I found that delightful. I also found your Inalienable Rights, as RITES. The Inalienable Rights was a fascinating play on the temple rituals, and so I appreciate your humor.
I'm sure there are others who do not, Paul.
Well, I suspect James Lucas does not, because his book makes it very clear that he thinks he and Jonathan Neville have made the case that it was not a stone in the hat, but it was the Urim and Thummim that they used for the translation. And in our forum, because we have so many people who have vantage points, perspectives that are clearly correct, and sometimes they're in conflict, makes it very interesting to have those discussions here. So I appreciate your using that stone in the hat explanation, but I'll be interested if James wants to get a question in as well.
Go ahead, James. You need to unmute.
There we go.
There you
Now
go.
I'm on mute. Okay. So I don't want to spend this particular session just kind of re-raising the main thrust of what we wrote a relatively long book about. But we argue in our book that we accept sort of the Joseph's and Oliver's account that it was, in fact, the Book of Mormon was a translation from the plates using the Urim and Thummim. So we probably have, different view on a lot of points than you do, maybe more like Dr. Anderson's view. But for this purposes of this, where we're focused on your views, I mean, from relatively early on, I'm intrigued by your idea that Joseph never even went up to the hill until 1826. Okay, but relatively early, I mean, by the late 1820s, when things are really getting going and the story of the Book of Mormon is starting to be, he's telling other people that he's having these experiences and so forth. Right from the very beginning, you have three aspects to the story that really are very early, and they appear, from the beginning, at least when he starts to recount the story to other people. One is the angel Moroni, two is the plates, and three is the spectacles, or the interpreters. We won't use the term Urim and Thummim because that's actually kind of confusing. So I was wondering, in your view, what is the role of those three, kind of central elements of the story of the Book of Mormon?
Refresh me on the three again.
Angel Moroni,
Yep.
the plates, the fact that he maintained that there were these real physical metal plates that the record was on, and then the spectacles, the interpreters, the Urim and what's we're sometimes call it the Urim and Thummim.
Yeah.
So these are three things that appear quite early in the account, and I was just wondering if, in your theory, these three elements play a role in your in your theory of how this all came about.
I don't think so. My own opinion is that there were no plates, and obviously they would be accompanied by the Urim and Thummim, and I don't think there was a Urim and Thummim, So I can't explain the angel Moroni again. It was some kind of what's it called? Theosophy. Anyway, seeing a vision, so forth. I guess I can say I don't think any of those three really existed.
Okay, so my question is, okay, that's a subject of a 2-century old debate. So I don't want to kind of raise that here, but rather I was wondering, do those, let's assume they were fictional, that he imagined those three elements, the angel, the plates, and the spectacles. What would be the psychiatric or psychological explanation for why, or let me ask this, I should phrase it this way. do you have any views as to why those three particular elements? Well, let's leave Angel Morain out because you've discussed that, but the claims of there being these physical objects to back up his story, the plates and the spectacles, do you from a your psychiatric point of view, do those two elements play a psychological role in the story, or are they just incidental and don't have any particular psychological meaning? Or would that be your view, or what would be your explanation? I'm not phrasing the question well, but that's.
Yeah, I know, I understand. And I think this is one where we agree to disagree. Joseph was a good biblical scholar. There's no question about that. And, he knew about the Urim and Thummim, and it was something that would be, that would appear to be something of use. It ties him to the Old Testament and so forth. I really can't answer your question except to say that we agree to disagree, and there's no answer that I can come up with other than that was part of the story, which began to develop in his teen years about the inhabitants of the continent. I'm sorry, that isn't a very good answer either.
No, I'm kind of throwing this at you cold, so I understand.
Let me jump in on here, James, because the chapter in the book, I think it's called "The Pleasure of Treasure."
Yes.
To me,
that's a cool title.
To me, that's sort of an explanation addressing what you're asking and his answer, because he was involved in the treasure hunting process. And clearly the benefits of being able to find a treasure helps to overcome all kinds of things. And so, yeah, it's a little bit of the Jack of the Beanstalk kind of a story. And so I suggest you will want to look at the book, and I think that chapter to some extent addresses your question.
Well, yeah,
okay.
It's the notion of the treasure hunt, and it's an old story, and it always has the same elements. There is a young fellow who is very poor, and Aladdin is that way, very poor, and somehow he finds a secret that will allow him to get the treasure and be able to help his mother, and and the treasure is always located somehow under a tree, and it is in a cavern and so forth. It's a story of sexuality, and it occurs. I can't describe the entire chapter, and I haven't looked at it in a while, but the story is always the same. It's the young boy who, in a penurious family, his mother needs him, and he finds this key that allows him to get the treasure, and he has to overcome all kinds of obstacles in order to get the treasure, and finally he does, and he brings it back, and his mother is satisfied, and so forth. That's a universal story, and this is the one that Joseph tells as well.
Okay, let me then press one other point a bit on behalf of my friend Richard Bushman. In his new book on the gold plates, Richard argues that the notion of an ancient record being recorded on these metal plates, in other words, the idea of there being gold, yes, you're quite, I certainly see your point that this is in many myths and so forth, the hero finding gold to rescue his family, that I well understand. But Richard argues that the notion that there was an ancient history written on these metal plates that are not to be used as a treasure to relieve the stress of the family is an unprecedented element of the story. Now, this again is a cold question, so you may not, have an immediate answer to that, but I was just wondering what your reaction would be to Richard Bushman's argument in his new book that the idea of an ancient record history being on these gold plates is a unique element to Joseph's story.
Well, I can only respond by saying that Joseph tried desperately to get a patent on this, or to get a copyright on it. You know, they did go around selling the books. So, I mean, that's all I can respond.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Very, very fascinating. Thank you for your presentation. And I'll take a look at that book.
Blair, did you have a question? You're muted. Blair, you're muted.
Yes, but I want to hold off and let other people go in there before I come up with it. Okay.
Okay. That's allowed.
And James, let me say that I really appreciate the repartee that we have had. It's a fascinating one to compare notes from very different paradigms.
And I appreciate both of you sharing. It's just delightful in the Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum to have people share their perspectives, be appreciated, and treat each other amicably. Thank you for doing that.
So, Bill, I have a question. So, do you think that Joseph did it intentionally, or like to mislead people, or do you think he actually believed all of this? You know what I mean?
It's a hard question to answer. Of course, you know that oh, come on, bad with names. The fellow who's done all of the not Todd Compton, but the one who's I'm sorry, he's done I've got several of his books up here. At any rate, he's
Dan Vogel, maybe?
What's that?
Dan Vogel?
Yes, Dan Vogel, thank you. The notion that he was a pious deceiver, I think was what he said. I think that was the term that he used. I don't think he was so much trying to deceive as he was trying to express what was inside him the same way that Stephen King did. And he has a very unique style with it. He had the charisma to go along with it. I'm troubled by the idea of a pious deceiver, but I think he was just working on these pieces. Now, that's not to say that you know, it isn't possible that the good Lord gave him the osteomyelitis in order that Nathan Smith could come and do that to him, so that he would have these visions and so forth. This doesn't say that there isn't a God in it. It's just that that's what I think he was working on, and that's why it turned out the way that it did.
Thank you. Kenneth, did you have a question?
Yeah, I have a couple of things. One, if he just thought this up, how come there are no erasers in the Book of Mormon? And how did he get the information on all the ruins in Central America? I mean, if he just thought it up, where he was at, he sure didn't have that information with him.
Let me think for a second. I don't know that he knew anything. I'm trying to think if there was any connection he had to Central America.
I think not until the Stevens and Catherwood book of 1842.
Okay, I know that much of this is from Ethan Smith in view of the Hebrews. That is the theme of that, is uh, the Hebrews crossing the ocean and populating the Americas and so forth. They're very similar there with Pursuit's book. But I don't think that there is anything that Joseph ever said about Central America. I think he was in the area of the mound builders in upstate New York, and that's where I think he was located. I don't know of any geography about Central America that he had. I think it was a much more general notion that trying to use the postulate that the Hebrews were the ones that populated America.
Okay, about the Noah racers. There's an area in Alma where it talks about them burying their weapons.
Yes.
When that happened, he said specifically, weapons of peace, which there are no such thing. Then he corrected himself for weapons of war for peace.
Yeah, I
If,
struggle. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
if he would have just made it up, he would have not even put that in there. I'll say about that much.
Yeah, I struggled with that particular metaphor. I don't know what it represented. In the book, I had several possibilities as to what that piece particularly recommended. Whether it was kind of a self-punishment thing, whether this is even the possibility of, when you talk about the Oedipal thing, this is, burying the potency in the ground so he would never masturbate again, or something like this. There are all kinds of possible interpretations of that, and I don't really know what it does mean, but I struggled with that one, and why people would automatically, bury their swords in the ground and invite the Lamanites to go and to kill them. That to me is a non-rational thing, and it's hard for me to imagine that anyone did that. I just am trying to think of what Joseph is saying by that, and I struggled with that.
Blair, did you change your mind again?
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay, Paul, go ahead.
Well, I'm going to, I would like to have you move another generations with me, because here I am at the Joseph Smith III home. And as I have identified with that young man at 11 years old, his father was headed off to Carthage. Major, the Mastiff, who had been with Joseph Smith since Zion's Camp of 1834, jumped out the upper floor window of the mansion house to be able to go to Carthage with Joseph Jr. Young Joseph had to wrap his arms around that big dog's neck and hang on to him to keep him there. And then Joseph and Hiram came back in their bodies in coffins, were laid out in the mansion house dining room. They put tar, vinegar, and sugar on the stove to cook, to hide the odor. His mother and his grandmother were weeping over the bodies, and here came 10,000 people to pay their respects, tromping through the house to look at the bodies and cry. It would appear to me that for young Joseph III, that must have been a pretty traumatic effect as well. I'm wondering to what extent you might see that as influencing his later life as well.
I'd never thought of that, Paul. I'm sure it was very disturbing to him. I don't know. I would not even begin to try to make that into a trauma that could explain other things in his life. I just don't know. It was a terrible, terrible time for everybody, that's for sure. But it's an interesting thought. I'm not an expert on Joseph III, and somebody else would have to do that one.
Well, he clearly was devoted to his father's memory and attempted to exonerate him from what he thought were unjust charges later. So at least there's a little bit of follow-up that way, I think. But yeah, it's I've identified with that little guy from having been there and felt some of those same pressures. And it was to the extent that he refused to let his kids have dogs because it was so painful for him when Major finally died.
Yeah. Good point.
Okay, Blair, now it's your turn. Go ahead, please.
Okay. I'm not a psychologist. If you put a hammer in the hands of a kid, though, everything looks like a nail. And he's going to hammer. There's no doubt about it. A child being affected by his background and things of the sort as you've explained there, Bill. But I happen to believe in the Book of Mormon and the story of the Book of Mormon. And I want to invite you to the class that I'm giving, in which case I can take the characters from the characters transcript or the Anthon transcript and show you that that is telling you what's in the Book of Mormon. And that's what I was ending up with tonight at my discussion. And we meet at 7 o'clock, just before the Book of Mormon Perspectives. And I want to invite you because I'm going to show you how you can take those characters and duplicate what's on the title page of the Book of Mormon. And I am not kidding you. You can do it if you'll pay attention to the instructions that I give you next Monday and the following Mondays.
Thank you.
You're invited.
I would also ask you to take a close look at those characters themselves, because if you have to invert them sometimes, but you will see an unmistakable JOS and JOE. And if you look even more closely, you will find an ALV twice.
Put a hammer in his hands and he's going to find what he's looking for, a nail.
We both can, Blair.
Okay.
I'm going to show you objective things that you can track through and find the meaning that's in the title page of the Book of Mormon. And I guarantee it, if you do it, you can see it. Okay?
Thank you for the invitation, Paul.
Okay.
Sorry.
Ron Edwards, go ahead, please.
Okay. Well, Bill, you can tell me if I've missed something, but this question just keeps nagging at my mind. How do you account for the witnesses that even on their deathbed, they swore that they saw and they handled those plates if they never existed? How do you, were those people weird? Was there something wrong with them?
Well,
I'm just curious.
I know only about Martin Harris, who said he really didn't see it with the physical eye, but only with the spiritual eye. The others have not said anything different, though many of them did not continue on with the organization. There's no question, but the wording of those that both of those were written by Joseph. It's unmistakable that he wrote them and then got the signatures. that's all that I can say. They are witnesses who have signed the document.
So you think that they just signed their name, but they never actually handled them?
I don't know.
I mean, every Book of Mormon that I'm aware of that's ever been published has somewhere, either in the front or the back of it, the words of those that actually handled them, and all of them saw them. So that like I say, I don't think there's been a book, a legitimate book, a Book of Mormon published that doesn't have those statements in there. Somehow those people have to be declared, or that was written by somebody else. That is that. Yeah, are you thinking that somebody else wrote that?
No, I just take it at face value.
Hmm.
I just remember Martin Harris's later comment that he never really did see them with his real eyes. It was just his spiritual eyes. I don't know anyone else that had ever commented to that effect later on.
Well, it's in all the Book of Mormons printed. All the Book of Mormons I have all make the or publishes the statements from those that that had the privilege of seeing the plates in person. So anyway, I was glued to the screen during during your presentation. Very interesting. I'll say that. Thanks for coming this evening.
I didn't try to destroy anyone's faith. That's your business, and how you interpret all of this is we all have some differences in our interpretation and so forth. I am not in Paul's introduction. He indicated that, you know, one of the rules, the editorial rules that I set up was that you don't advocate or you don't disparage a religion, or we don't publish your paper. I'm talking only about Joseph Smith. He's my subject. The religion is independent of that. So there are some features that I will say are sort of ephemized in the religion itself.
Well, I've never heard anybody better described what Joseph went through with those operations that were performed on him. My, that boy, that makes your heart go out for somebody that had to put up with that back in those days. Reminds me of the people that had leeches put on their backs, and I'm glad I don't have to go to the doctor and get them put on my back to suck something out of me.
It was awful. It was awful.
Yeah, thanks for that information. My goodness, it says a lot about what he went through.
Hey, thanks, Ron. James Lucas, go ahead.
So just a couple of just points of information. We won't spend time getting into them. First of all, there are also people who argue that the witness statements were written by Oliver Cowdery. I mean, in other words, just FYI, that's an argument that's out there, that it wasn't, because Joseph really wasn't a writer. He was a dictator in that he liked to dictate, but he was not a guy who'd sat down and scrivened out any kind of extensive writing. So just there are people who argue that that was actually Oliver Cowdery that drafted the witness statements. Secondly, to the point about Martin Harris's that comment about spiritual witness, again, there's a whole literature about this, but there's an argument that quote, it's a good quote, it's an authentic quote. Nobody's disputing that he didn't say those words to whoever it was that recorded them. But there's an argument that that is misinterpreted, that when he spoke of spiritual eyes, he wasn't saying not his physical eyes. He was just saying that he had to be transformed. You had to be spiritual in a spiritual state in order to participate in the vision. Because I have personally seen dozens of accounts of people who heard from Martin Harris where he emphasized that he, in fact, did see the things with his physical eyes. You know, he would turn to his interlocutor and say, you know, just as clearly as I see you sitting in that chair, I saw those plates and I saw the angel, and so forth. So just FYI, there's a body of literature on that. But the point I wanted to just quickly make here is that, or a question I had for you, is that, so, you know, we've written a whole book, and one of our arguments about Joseph Smith is that this traumatic childhood surgery was what set him on his path to prophethood, if you will. And which, you know, is not incompatible with your analysis as well. You're saying that this was a huge event in developing the personality of Joseph Smith. And we would agree with that, except we just see different consequences.
We both agree. Interestingly, Leroy Worthland is a doctor who is anesthesiologist at the Massachusetts General Hospital, who came up to Dartmouth Baker Library and dug this story out for the first time. And he and I both agree that were it not for Nathan Smith, there would be no Mormonism. There would be no Book of Mormon. There would be nothing. We just disagree on why. Matter of fact, the only reason I wrote this book was, and you got to understand, Hanover, New Hampshire is 20 minutes from Sharon, Vermont. And that's the birthplace and so forth. But
right.
I was just sitting early on my career at Dartmouth, I was sitting at a table with the dean of the medical school. And he said, by the way, did you know that Nathan Smith, our founder, operated on Joseph Smith? And I practically jumped out of my chair. And I said, well, how do you know this? He said, well, this guy Leroy Worthland came up here and he dug the story out. And that was what got me started. Otherwise, I wouldn't have ever had anything to do with it, I suspect. And I read his book, I read his story, and it was clear he had mined the lode all that there was. But the second time that I read the thing, it just clobbered me, because I was told in my in Harvard Medical School in Nehemiah's lecture that you have to be very careful about operating on boys around this age because of this existing piece, and especially having anything to do with an extremity. And that was what came back to me. And so I thought, my golly, maybe there's something here. But I didn't get a chance to develop it until it was about 4 years later, when I had a parodontectomy canceled in the morning, and I just went over to the library and started to dig in. And you know, Mormon history, little Mormon history, is like being a little bit pregnant, and that.
Yeah. So here's my quick question for you. And again, if this is like too big of an issue to talk about in this particular setting, that I understand. My co-author, Jonathan Neville, he had a near-death experience. Won't go into the details, but you know, he had what he describes as a near-death experience. He was attacked and was, you know, taken and you know, people thought he would die because of the consequences of the attack. So this was as an adult that he had this. So when we were researching the young Joseph Smith and developing this sort of argument about how the surgery set Joseph on the path to prophethood, is how we see it, my friend Jonathan compared the surgery to his own near-death experience. And he describes Joseph as a result of the surgery having a near-death experience, which is something that, you know, set him on this track of being very interested in religion and very contemplative and so forth. And he was on crutches for years afterwards, and this left him, you know, having an atypical, you know, farm boy youth. So I was just wondering now, I don't know what the current psychiatric view of near-death experiences is, but I was just wondering if you had any immediate views based on your experience and your work in this area as to whether we could describe this surgery as a near-death experience that would have had a big impact on young Joseph's personality development.
There is some very that has been done recently on near-death experiences. And it's been done in hospitals in settings in which death is about to occur. And it's with permission and all of those things that go along with it, and, you know, informed consent and so forth. And what happens is that although the heart stops, the brain goes on, and it gets some very, very wild activity that goes on for a couple of minutes before it shuts down. So everything else is gone, but the brain is just going like crazy. And then when things come back, you get these descriptions of all kinds of weird stuff that's happening. But the brain does, it's a very specific event. This has been in, I've seen several of the New York Times and other things about this. I've never read any of the specific papers, but that is what's known about near-death experiences.
I mean, would you, now this is just a question that's you'd have to speculate, but do you think it's possible from the research you've done that Joseph, in the course of these surgeries, might have had that kind of experience? Might it have been so traumatic that he might have had the kind of physiological, neurological reaction that you're describing, at least as a possibility?
That would require that he have his heart stopped and then had it restarted again. It's a traumatic event, but I think it's probably separate from a near-death experience.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Carol had a question in the chat. Bill, do you believe the hat in the stone translation is also not genuine?
No, I think there's enough corroboration of the fact that that the translation was done with the stone in the hat. I don't know if that answers the question, but I think the preponderance of evidence and the descriptions are that it was a stone in the hat method of at least in part of his translations. Now, it was all done behind a curtain, and of course there are those who say that it was done behind a curtain because he had to quote from Isaiah, but that's another matter. But the stone in the hat has extensive corroboration, even from Emma.
So well, I wrote a book about this, but I'm not going to get into that. Carol, is your question, so the question is, so Joseph put his face in his hat and put his scrying stone in the bottom of the hat. I think, Carol, is your question, was the stone active? In other words, was the Book of Mormon appearing on the stone as Joseph dictated it, or was that just kind of an act and Joseph was making it all up in his head? Is that your question, Carol? I think I'm speculating, but I think that's what Carol's asking is, do you think the stone actually was showing the words of the Book of Mormon, as opposed to Joseph just using that as a setting to trigger his imagination as he then spun off the Book of Mormon out of his own head to his scribes?
If that was the question, no, I don't think there was wording on the stone. I think he had the stories and he was putting them together. I, 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 no, I don't think that, I don't think he was reading anything. But again, people who scry, that's the term that's used, somehow just, the words just come. One of the things that Dr. Nehemiah taught me when we were enjoying some very good sherry at his house was that many people describe it's the creative process. Sometimes people just say the words just come. I don't know where they're coming from, but they just come and they can explain nothing further. They just that the words come there, and sometimes it occurs with scrying, with some kind of crystal ball or whatever. But that's a well-described phenomenon. But I do not think that there were words on the stone, in my opinion.
Thank you.
I have not heard the hat and the stone since this Zoom meeting started. I've never heard of such a thing. And it just seems like, where are the proofs and the evidences for using such a translation? If you cannot believe in the Urim and Thummim, how can you possibly stretch it as far as a stone in a hat? I mean, it doesn't make logical sense to me.
It doesn't to me either, but we know that that's what scrying is.
Okay,
Thank you.
Paul, go ahead, please.
Wow, this is fascinating. I'm intrigued. I think maybe it may support your thesis in the fact that Emma didn't get to see the plates. Presumably moved them while cleaning and so forth, but the idea that Emma didn't get to see the plates may very well be a support of what you're saying. Question for you.
Many times, the plates were way in the woods, and he was just sitting there translating or scrying and describing what was there, and the plates weren't even nearby; they were hid in the woods.
Question that I wanted to ask you is relative to that psychological trauma of being separated from his parents. I mean, a 7-year-old to be sent off to Uncle Jesse in Salem. Mama lets that happen. Papa lets that happen. Nobody is supporting him to want him to stay home. It seemed to me like that the psychological trauma of that, and I don't think he'd had any previous contact with Uncle Jesse to be able to make it so that would be a familiar, warm place. Just that, yeah, he was along the seacoast. Maybe that would be a better spot for him. So there's a decision being made for him. But wow, it sounds tyrannical to me, and it must have been a psychological blow again.
Oh yeah, but again, as I said before, I know what these kids are like, and they just regress back to a much earlier stage of development. And by that time, the wound would have smelled, it would have had maggots in it. And there are maggots in the Book of Mormon that he describes. And he would have been, unable to control his bladder and bowels and so forth. And their mouths to feed and the things to be done, and he requires full-time care. I'm not surprised they sent him off to the seashore.
Well, but what impact did that have upon his own sense of family?
Well, it's a big loss. That's his only support group. It's the only ones you've ever known.
And so in the future, when he builds a family, then he's gone most of the time. Interesting to me to see that the cohesive family that we'd sort of like to see is something we largely have to make up.
Yeah. And I can't imagine the trip to the seashore with that bad leg on the roads that were there at the time was any pleasure either.
Right. Ladies and gentlemen, it's 9:45, and some of us get to work tomorrow, but I certainly don't want to shut off anyone's good questions or comment.
There is a comment in the chat from Bruce Nelson. I just want to express to everyone how grateful I am to be present tonight for this discussion and how respectful everyone has been with each other. Each one of you are awesome. Thank you, Bruce. It's been good to have you with us.
Thank you, Bruce. I'm sure we'll have more conversations about this coming up.
So, Bill, are you going to the John Whitmer Historical Association meeting this year?
I hate to bring up politics, but I think my answer to that is, does Trump lie? Of course, I'm going to the JRBJ.
Okay, good. I look forward to meeting you.
Yes, likewise.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, the Lord is watching o'er you. Good night, his blessings go before you. Good night, and we'll be praying for you. So good night, may God bless you.
Thank you, Paul.
Paul, I have a question.
All right.
It is not connected to this presentation, but I'd like to know that do you know of any pictures of Joseph Smith